First of all, I'd like to welcome all Society members and guests from other organisations to what promises to be a most interesting address. First of all, for those who aren't familiar with the Society, I'll just briefly explain. We're a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to studying all aspects of aviation in the Great War. We put out 2 journals every year, 4 newsletters. We have meetings, we have a website which gives you links to lots of research material, including a database of everyone we can find with an Australian connection who served in an air service during the war. So we have a lot. We welcome new members, so if anyone's not a member and tempted to join us, submit to the temptation. And we're cheap too. Our speaker today is Michael Molkentin, who is probably well known to all of you as the author of a number of books on Australian aviation in the Great War period. His first book was Fire in the Sky, a most readable and thoroughly well-researched history of the Australian Flying Corps, and the first real history of the Corps since Cutlack's history in 1923. I'll just read what our Society's patron, the then Chief of the Air Force, Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, said in his introduction. It is an important book, an engaging and eminently readable story populated by ordinary Australians who found themselves in the extraordinary circumstances of history's first air war. His work is thoroughly well informed, drawing on the records of British and Australian archives, as well as collections held privately by families. Now, he followed that book up with Volume 1 of Australia in the centenary history of Australia in the Great War, and that was Australia and the War in the Air in 2014. He expanded on Fire in the Sky and covered the origins of military aeronautics in Australia from 1908 to 1914, the organisation of Australia's training and eventual fighting squadrons, the legacy of that history leading to the formation of the RAAF in 1921. It contains appendices showing lots of details, and in addition, the book tells the story of Australians who served in the RFC, RNAS and RAF. Finally, we get to the book that we're looking at now. 100 years after the conclusion of the Great England to Australia air race, Michael published Anzac and Aviator, the remarkable story of Sir Ross Smith and the 1919 England to Australia air race. It's been praised in reviews, and it unearthed a lot of information about Ross Smith's little-known pre-war experiences in the outback and his time on Gallipoli, as well as his flying time with 1 Squadron AFC in Palestine. The story behind the book, which is what we're about to hear, is fascinating, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to it. So I think we now link across to Michael.
Thanks, Gareth. I'm really honoured to be invited to present this address, and I just wanted to thank Gareth and the members of the executive committee and Des for using his technical wizardry to make all this happen on Zoom. Just before I begin, I'm assuming everyone can see the picture of the book cover at the moment. Yep. And that's now changed to a photograph. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, all right, we're ready to go. This photograph is probably not known to many Australians, but I would argue is certainly one of the most significant photographs in Australian aviation history. We don't know who it was taken by, probably someone who lived in Darwin, and it was taken around 3 p.m. on the 10th of December 1919. And you know, while its composition and its preservation and its condition maybe leave a little bit to be desired, what it depicts is something quite extraordinary. It depicts the moment that a Vickers Vimy twin-engine biplane bomber touched down on Australian soil 28 days after leaving London. And it was the first time, of course, that an aircraft had done this. It was the only aircraft at this point to complete the government's sponsored competition for the first Australian to fly from England to Australia. And it earned the crew that was led by Ross Smith, a young South Australian Flying Corps pilot. It earned him and his crew a £10,000 prize. And really this was, you know, one of several extraordinary transcontinental flights that happened in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, and I would argue were significant in bringing aviation into peacetime and showing the world what aviation might have to offer the post-war world. I first came across Ross Smith while I was writing my first book, Fire in the Sky, that Gareth mentioned before. He was a relatively minor character, though, in that book because it covered the whole Australian Flying Corps during the course of the war. Then when I was researching my PhD thesis, my supervisor, actually, Peter Stanley, he came across Ross Smith's private papers in the State Library, the State Library in South Australia. And he suggested to me that I might want to take a look at these for my PhD research. And I got across to Adelaide, and I was amazed at this extraordinary collection of private papers. It would have to be one of the most comprehensive set of private papers by a serviceman from the First World War that I've come across. Literally hundreds of letters. The main part of the collection is literally hundreds of letters that Ross wrote to his mother during the war years and in the years immediately following. But there's also an enormous amount of documentation relating to the England to Australia flight and other aspects of Ross's life as well. I didn't really get to use them very much in my PhD because it was more focused on the political and strategic aspects of Australia's involvement in the First Air War. But I did think at the time that they would make a really, really good basis for a biography of Ross Smith. And a couple of years after finishing my PhD, I took the idea to Allen and Unwin, and they were keen for it. Although it appears that the book came out to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the flight, it was, in fact, the book was 2 years late. Because in the meantime, my wife and I had a couple of kids, and I'd had to get my career back on track after doing a PhD. So it was really a serendipity that it coincided with the centenary, and it probably hasn't hurt sales, but it wasn't initially designed to be like that. It's the first time I'd written biography. I found it a really rewarding challenge. Going from writing history to biography, I found the biggest challenge was trying to get the balance right between the macro picture, so that the individual life, and then the big picture. The micro and the macro. So sort of the individual and the context, because of course, when you're writing biography, you need to get that balance right because it's about the individual, but you also need to be exploring and explaining how the broader context shapes that individual's life and how they interact with their context. Today, what I want to do is really only provide you with a bare outline of Ross Smith's life, which I discovered obviously involved much more than that extraordinary 28 days in 1919 when he led his crew from England to Australia. But what I more want to do today is give you a behind-the-scenes look at how I researched and wrote the book over a period of 4 years, and particularly talk about the sources that I used to reconstruct Ross's life and bring it to the page. So the first part of the book deals with Ross's early life. In that sense, it's a fairly traditional biographical format. It's a cradle-to-grave biography. Like, I suppose, most famous people from history, there's not a lot of written documentation about him before he became famous. And there was a real challenge that I had in piecing together Ross's childhood. Obviously began with genealogical records, though given the commonality of his surname, that proved to be incredibly difficult. And I'm not a genealogist, so I had to do a bit of training and practice with that. But yeah, Ross begins life in 1892, and he's raised in the outback in South Australia. His father's the manager of Mutooroo, which is and still is today one of the largest sheep grazing stations in South Australia. And his father was quite successful in running that venture. Made the company that he worked for a lot of money, and eventually ended up being one of the sort of co-managers on the company's board. So Ross and his two brothers, Keith and Colin. Keith, of course, was was the Navigator on the England to Australia flight later in 1919. And Colin, the youngest brother, he was killed at Passchendaele in October 1917. But the boys spent their early years on Mutooroo in remote outback South Australia, where, as far as I can tell, they had a fairly typical bush upbringing, hunting, riding. Ross developed his great fondness for horses during that period of his childhood. And yeah, living and working among the shearers that his father hired seasonally to come and shear the sheep that were on the station. When Ross was 10 and Keith was 12, the parents sent them to a private boarding school in Adelaide, the Queen's School. It closed down in the 1940s, but they went and boarded in Adelaide at the Queen's School, and Ross spent all of his adolescence, more or less, except the school holidays, in suburban Adelaide. Partway through his adolescence, his mother did buy a house in Adelaide, and his father more or less would go between living in Adelaide and working out on the station. So they became an Adelaide family during his adolescence. In terms of the childhood, I suppose I saw Ross's childhood as being important in trying to explain the adult that he became. And I suppose partly my profession as a teacher, I'm aware of how significant especially those adolescent years are at forming character and personality. And I wanted to try and get to the bottom of how did Ross's upbringing shape him, and how did it sort of, create the man that he would become later on, and how did it influence his adult life. I didn't have a whole lot of explicit hard evidence to go off. The first words that we have in Ross's own handwriting, the first time we hear his voice, is not until he's 21 years of age, in one of the first letters that he wrote to his mum when he went away at the start of the First World War. So really I had to rely on a whole heap of other sources to try and piece together aspects of his childhood. Unfortunately, the school that he went to, the records had been destroyed for the period that he attended, which was a big disappointment, although I did manage to recover a couple of school yearbooks and prospectuses. And while they didn't mention Ross specifically, they gave me a good sense of the type of education he had. Newspapers were also a real boon, and I've got to say here the digitally searchable newspapers on Trove, which is Australia's the National Library runs a kind of meta catalogue that covers a lot of things, including a whole heap of digital newspapers. That was a real boon because it allowed me to search through obviously enormous quantities of newsprint that no individual could possibly hope to go through, and pinpoint some examples of Ross's schooling and childhood, things like speech days that were reported on in the newspapers, and sporting meets and so on. And from that, I was able to discover that I think there were sort of three pillars in Ross's childhood that really shaped the type of person he was. The first one was sport. He was a very keen sportsman. He played cricket and rugby. He was a keen athlete as well. And the Edwardians in the early part of the 20th century, they saw sport not just for physical fitness, but they saw it as building moral character as well, and very much you see this kind of resonate throughout Ross's life. In the later letters that he writes to his mother, he often refers to sporting metaphors, and it's clear that he has a sense of what good sportsmanship and good conduct is based on his experiences on the sporting fields, playing for Queens. Also, I think you could probably infer that he got some of his early leadership experiences. He captained their first 11 cricket team, for example, and their AFL team while he was at school. And later on, I think that would manifest itself in later leadership opportunities that he had. The second strain that we see in his childhood, or the second pillar that his childhood was based on, was empire nationalism. At Queen's, the Queen's School was very much based on the model of a British public school, one of the GPS schools, and he very much had an upbringing in which his Australian and British identities were not seen as at odds with one another, but seen as completely complementary. And he very much considered himself an Australian Briton. And later on in his letters, he would certainly describe himself as being British. In fact, his parents were Scots, but and while he did see himself as Scottish as well, that sort of sense of being part of the British Empire was always something that informed his worldview. And the third pillar of his childhood that I think I identified was militarism. Ross grew up in a society that venerated military service, not as a career opportunity, like we might tend to more see it now, but as a civic duty. And while he was at school at Queen's, he was part of the cadets, and later on he joined the militia and was part of the citizen military forces. And in fact, that membership of the cadets provided him with a formative experience when he was 17 years old. In 1910, Ross, as part of the Adelaide Mounted Cadets, he went overseas on a world tour with a group of cadets selected from all over Australia. They went all the way across Europe, visiting barracks and arms factories and attending military exercises, then across the Atlantic and across North America, both the US and Canada. And that was a really formative experience for Ross, and it gave him a determination to have a military career. And certainly later in his letters, he refers quite often to this experience of going overseas. Also, the cadet tour provided him with his first identifiable experience with aviation. And I've got to say here, this is where one of my favourite sources that I came across came from. I suspected that the cadet tour was going to be significant, but again, I had very little evidence. There were some newspaper reports, but nothing in Ross's hand. I mean, as I said, he mentioned some things in later letters as an adult about his experiences as a 17-year-old cadet, but I didn't have the detail that I was hoping to have. I did find a newspaper report that listed all of the cadets' names who went on the world tour, and I spent some time running those through various search engines and catalogues, and I discovered that one of the cadets, a guy named Clifford Brown, a trumpeter, same age as Ross, actually kept a diary of the cadet tour, and it was at the State Library in Victoria. And I ordered copies of that diary, and I didn't really know what to expect. Of course, you know, a diary could be simply a list of places they visited and dates, which in itself would have been helpful just to piece together what the cadets did, or it could have been something much more substantial. And when I got it, I was thrilled to see that it was a very detailed diary. And then reading it, I was even more thrilled to see that not only does it mention Ross Smith on several occasions, but Clifford Brown, the diarist, became one of Ross Smith's best friends, and they shared a room together on the tour. So I had this incredibly rich account of the cadet tour that mentions Ross at many, many junctions during the 3-month tour overseas, including in August 1910 when Clifford Brown, Ross Smith and a couple of other boys on a day off, they caught the train out from London to Brooklands Aerodrome, and they saw a flying display, and Clifford Brown talks about their amazement at seeing aircraft flying. And this is a cover on the screen at the moment from Flight magazine. Of that day, there was a French pilot, Robert Cordonnier, who crashed his aircraft into the River Wey, and Ross saw that. And I think that's probably the first time he actually saw aircraft flying. Now, we don't have his impressions of it, but Clifford Brown says they were amazed at it. There's also a tragic irony there in that very same location, Brooklands Aerodrome, is going to be where both the 1919 England to Australia air race started, or the Vimy was built there, and Ross kind of was based there as they were preparing. But it was also the location of Ross Smith's untimely death in 1922 due to an air accident. The records get a lot better when Ross joins the AIF in August 1914 at the beginning of the First World War. He's one of those really keen first contingent to enlist. Like I'd mentioned, he came home from the cadet tour wanting a military career, and the war certainly provided him with the opportunity to do so. He joined the Light Horse. So at this stage, of course, the Australian Flying Corps was really only just the very, very small flying establishment at Point Cook. So there was really no opportunity for him to fly at this stage. But he joined the Light Horse, and he very quickly was promoted to an NCO rank because they were desperate, of course, for leaders, and Ross had some limited leadership experience both on the sporting field and through the cadets. The next 4 years of Ross's life during the First World War, I found, were by far the most well documented. As I've already mentioned, there's the letters that he wrote to his mother, literally hundreds of pages, spanning almost the entire war. And there's just one example I've provided here from February 1917, describing some flying that he was doing at that point. Unfortunately, I mean, the letters are brilliant. They've got a lot of strengths. Ross had a very close relationship with his mother, Jessie. As you can see here, he calls her mother, my dearest. Very, very affectionate and close and open relationship. And he shares with her, a lot of details about his service. He's quite frank and candid. So some of the letters are quite revealing about the violence and the dreadful conditions that he found himself in at various places during his wartime service. And they're also quite revealing about his emotional and psychological state as well, which is a little bit uncommon in my experience looking at First World War letters. There's also letters that he wrote to his brothers, to Keith and Colin, that survive, as well as a few letters to other friends as well during the war. And they're all really, really rich in their detail and in their evidence of how he perceived his wartime service and what he was thinking and feeling at various times. Of course, beyond this, we've got the official records that are generated by the Defence Department and other official organisations about Ross's service that help us to piece together where he was and what he was doing during that time. So Ross goes overseas in October 1914 with the first contingent of the AIF. He trains with the Light Horse in Egypt, and after the Gallipoli landings in April 1915, he, along with the rest of the 3rd Light Horse Brigade, is deployed without their horses as effectively infantry, and Ross then spends the next 5 months on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Now, this is one section of his wartime service that was a bit difficult for me to write about because it's one of the kind of periods during the war when Ross is not as regular with his letter writing to his mother. Also, the letters, I think, downplay some of the privations. He's often quite upbeat and optimistic in the letters, telling his mother they've got plenty of food and the conditions are really good, which, of course, as we all know, that wasn't the case at all. This photograph, Ross didn't take this photo. He did take a camera to war and took a lot of photos. This wasn't one of his, but it does show the 2 locations that Ross spent most of his time at Gallipoli in the 5 months he was there, Pope's Hill and Quinn's Post, both more or less at the apex of the Anzac position at Gallipoli. One of the ways that I got around Ross's reticence to describe his experiences at Gallipoli was to use the letters and diaries of other members of his unit, of the 3rd Light Horse Regiment, and particularly where possible, men who were in his squadron, which at the time was B Squadron. And using those, I think I was able to piece together a picture of what his experiences were like at Gallipoli. And I've just got a short extract I was going to share with you here from the book that I think sort of illustrates how I used other people's accounts to fill in some of the gaps where we don't have Ross's own words. So I'll pick it up here in August, shortly after the August 1915 offensive, where Ross's unit, the 3rd Light Horse Regiment, was actually quite fortunate. They were spared a lead role in that disastrous offensive, but afterwards they were used to plug up the gaps in the line at Quinn's Post. The state of Quinn's Post surprised Ross. It had become a much more secure position since his first terrifying night there back in May. He wrote, quote, "Now there are nice deep trenches and in places overhead cover and steel loopholes, and all the way along netting is put up high in front of the trench to stop the bombs coming in," end quote. Still, compared to Pope's Hill, Ross considered Quinns a quote-unquote rotten post. To its immediate rear, steep slopes drop down into Monash Valley. In front, barely a dozen metres away, the Turks had a heavily defended front line with numerous machine guns trained on Quinns. Ross would say little else about his month at Quinns Post. He apparently sent home only 2 relatively brief letters during his month there. This uncharacteristic disruption in his correspondence is itself suggestive of the difficult time that he had there during August. The accounts of other men in the 3rd Light Horse confirm that it was a dreadful experience for all of them. Quote, "Here the enemy are less than 15 yards away and bombs are thrown into our trenches all day and night long," were the first impressions that one man in Ross's unit had of Quinns. Quote, "One has to be ever ready for a charge too on account of the very short warning," end quote. 5 days later, another of Ross's comrades in B Squadron recorded that, quote, "The smell of our dead in front is something sickening and the flies are nearly driving me silly," end quote. Another one added, quote, "One's food is simply black with flies while the weather is cruelly hot," end quote. Ross remained at Gallipoli until September 1915. He didn't make it right through to the evacuation. He had a number of really narrow escapes at that time, and I suppose researching his life, it was quite remarkable to me just how much things hinged on luck or fate or contingency. You know, he had a number of narrow escapes from snipers' bullets and artillery shells, and indeed his best friend Gordon Timbrell was shot through the head by a sniper while standing beside him at Quinns Post in the middle of the year. In September, like most of the other men in the 3rd Light Horse, Ross became quite ill with enteric fever, and he was evacuated from Gallipoli in September and sent to Gibraltar initially, and then on to Britain. And he nearly died during that voyage from enteric fever, as many other men did. So again, it's fortunate that we even know his name as a significant Australian aviator at all. After recovering, Ross returned to the Light Horse in the Sinai, where he was involved in the patrolling of the Sinai Desert during the middle of 1916. And it's in late 1916 that he first hears of the Australian Flying Corps, which of course had deployed a squadron, number 1 squadron, to serve in Palestine in the middle of 1916. And really what's behind Ross's transfer to the Australian Flying Corps, which is one of the most significant moments in his wartime career. First up, it's boredom. He's bored with what he sees as seemingly endless desert patrols, where they don't really see the Turks very often, and when they do, the contacts are usually fleeting. And indeed, Ross was already, before he'd heard of the Australian Flying Corps, was contemplating transferring to an artillery unit to go and serve on the Western Front, where he perceived there'd be more action and more chance for promotion. There's also, however, a sense in Ross's letters to his mum from this period that he perceives that aviation is going to be a significant thing after the war, and he can see future career prospects in flying. And he writes to his mum during this period that he's thinking of transferring to the Australian Flying Corps because, it might offer him good job prospects after the war. Remarkably as well, during this time, he writes rather whimsically to his mother about imagining if he could get in an aeroplane and fly all the way home to see her, which of course is something that he does a couple of years later. Also, Ross was driven by his ambitions to achieve a captaincy. One of the really interesting aspects of his personality that I think came out in the letters for me was that he was an incredibly driven individual, incredibly ambitious, but certainly not egotistical or ostentatious in any way. In fact, he was often embarrassed by attention, and he would constantly remind his mother not to share the details of their letters to friends and family or to put them in the newspapers. But he was incredibly driven, and I think this is something I've seen in other airmen that I've studied from this period, the likes of Kingsford Smith, Hinkler, even others like Lindbergh and so on. So there was this really singular focus and always looking for the next thing to move on to. He could never sort of sit still. So Ross transfers to the Australian Flying Corps in November 1916. He's he's wanted by the squadron essentially because as a light horseman, he knows the ground well, he knows the tactics well, and at this point in time, No. 1 Squadron is mostly cooperating with the light horse. He proves to be an outstanding observer, and he serves through the early months of 1917, flying over the first 2 Gaza battles. And in April 1917, he finally gets his wish to transfer to pilot school, to transfer to pilot training, and he attends flying school in Egypt, and then comes back to the squadron in mid-1917 as a pilot. And this, of course, results in really the most famous, probably a period of his wartime career, flying initially BEs and Martinsides, but later on in early 1918, Bristol fighters. And yeah, this is the period in that year. He shoots down, or he's credited with 12 enemy aircraft. He flies with a few different observers, but Pard Mustard is probably the most common one in early 1918. There's a number of accounts in the book about his dogfights, including the one in September 1917 when he was shot through the face, another very narrow escape for him. And that's him recovering in hospital there in the photograph. Besides the letters to his mother in which he describes flying and aerial combat, we've got, of course, his combats in the air reports from the squadron war diaries, and he's mentioned quite frequently in the letters and diaries and memoirs of other members of the Australian Flying Corps as well. By the end of the war, Ross had emerged as probably one of the most experienced and well-known Australian pilots in the Middle East. He'd been awarded the Military Cross on 2 occasions, and he received the DFC on 3 occasions. And he's only one, I think, of 3 or 4 British Empire pilots to get the DFC 3 times during the war. So, you know, quite a distinguished flying career there. He'd also distinguished himself by his experiences. In the middle of 1918, RAF headquarters in the Middle East actually assigned Ross to fly the Handley Page twin-engine bomber 0400 that the RAF had brought out to the Middle East to participate in Allenby's final campaigns against the Turks. Ross learned to fly this large aircraft and had some significant experience towards the end of the war flying that aircraft over long distances. And it was that saw him, at the end of the war, invited to take part in an RAF survey of airfields across the Middle East and Asia, effectively a flight from Cairo to Calcutta in December 1918. And Ross was the chief pilot on this. Going along with him, though, were Generals Amyas Borton and Geoffrey Salmond as well, so 2 of the highest-ranking RAF officers in the Middle East at the end of the war, as well as Ross's mechanics Wally Shires and Jim Bennett, who'd worked with him in No. 1 Squadron and who would later accompany him on the England to Australia flight. This journey across the Middle East and Asia is really significant in Ross's career, but it's something that most previous accounts of Ross Smith's life have really not sort of said much about and have glossed over. And the reason it's so significant is that after they arrive in Calcutta, Ross and Borton decide to extend their journey further south and to actually survey an aerial route from Calcutta all the way down to Indonesia, effectively giving them, putting them within flying distance of Australia's north coast. Now, at this stage, there's no airfields or aerodromes at any point along that route. So they carry out this survey by sea during the early months of 1919. And they're doing this with a view to later on fly the Handley Page that they've flown all the way to Calcutta, with a view to flying it all the way to Australia. Now, this is before the government has announced the England to Australia air race competition, and it's before any of that happens. So Ross is doing this independently along with Amyas Borton. And that's really, yeah, I must say I didn't really know anything about that beforehand, but I found this extraordinary file from the Air Ministry at the National Archives, and I think probably I'm one of the first people to have used it, certainly in publication, since it was released to the public in 1971, and it's a 400-page file that details that survey by sea that Ross and Borton made across Southeast Asia. So they go through Burma, Malaya, down through the Dutch East Indies, and as far as Timor in the early months of 1919. And essentially what they're doing is they're identifying locations which the RAF could build airfields to facilitate a future England to Australia commercial and military air route. But also they're looking at places they might land on a much sooner flight to Australia in the Handley Page 0400. And this was a fantastic source for me because Borton became sick with malaria during the voyage, and Ross ended up doing a lot of the legwork himself, and a number of the files are actually written and signed by him, as you can see here in one example. These aren't just a great record of the work they did in looking at aerodrome locations, but they're also a fascinating snapshot of Southeast Asia in 1919 and a really fascinating sort of almost social history of these two Western men, these two British and Australian men experiencing Southeast Asian culture at that time period. It's quite extraordinary, and Ross writes about it in some of his notebooks and diaries and letters as well. Now, the reason why this is so significant is that later on when Ross does make the flight to Australia, he's going to draw on the experience of seeing these airfields firsthand. Indeed, in these reports, Ross and Borton say to the Air Ministry, most of these locations they've identified as potential landing grounds should not be attempted by pilots who haven't actually walked on the ground themselves and seen it firsthand. So compared to the other competitors, Ross had a significant advantage because he'd already gone across this route with Borton in early 1919. So then how do we get to the England to Australia air race? Well, in March 1919, Ross and Borton return from Timor, where they've been inspecting these airfields, and they return to Calcutta, ready to start the flight to Australia in their Handley Page 0400, only to discover that that aircraft had been destroyed in a storm. And so their plans are dashed. And it's around this time that they learn through the newspapers of the government's offer of a £10,000 prize for the first Australian airman to fly from England to Australia. So they resolve to return to England and enter the competition. Now, of course, this discounts Borton because he's not an Australian, but Ross teams up instead with Keith, his brother, who he meets in Britain for the first time since he left Australia in 1914, and they recruit Shires and Bennett as well to be part of the crew. The selection of Keith as navigator is an interesting one. Keith had he tried to join the AFC during the war, but failed on several occasions. So he paid his own passage to Britain and he joined the RFC. He didn't see any active combat service. He worked in a training squadron, and I think he'd flown something like 30 different aircraft types by the time the war ended, and he had a significant number of hours in his logbook. Going through his logbook, however, it quickly became clear to me that he certainly was no navigator. And he was going to be navigating, the 12,000 miles to Australia, yet his logbook suggests that, I suppose, as most instructors would have at the time, he'd done most of his flying within sight of the aerodrome. So the fact that Ross chose him, I think, was probably more to do with their kinship and their very close relationship than with Keith's proven track record as a navigator. That said, he did an extraordinary job on the trip to Australia, even if, in my view, it was a bit of a gamble. So this map shows the route that Ross and the crew planned to Australia. They planned to essentially do the flight in 18 days with 7 days of rest and leaving 5 days contingency. And that would mean they'd be in Australia within the 30 days limit that the government had set. The distances that Ross planned to fly were all under 1,500 kilometres. So each hop or jump was under 1,500 kilometres, which was within range of the Vimy that they were using. But the issue wasn't really the issue wasn't so much the distances involved. It was more the availability of airfields and infrastructure. So for the first, really, I divide in the book the journey up into 3 legs. So there was the journey across Europe, which was serviced by either RAF or Allied Air Force aerodromes, and of course they were very well serviced during this section of the flight. They did, however, leaving in December 1919, they did, however, face the European winter, which presented its own challenges. The next leg was from Egypt, from Cairo to Calcutta, and this, of course, across the Middle East. The RAF did have bases across Jordan, Transjordan, and Iraq, or what they called Mesopotamia and India, but they were much more widely spread out, and their facilities were certainly not as well developed. The weather, however, on this leg of the route would be a lot better. The most challenging part of the route, however, was going to be from Calcutta to Darwin, and that's because, not necessarily because of the distances involved, but simply because there were practically no airfields. In fact, the only airfield between Calcutta and Darwin that was established at the time of the race was in Bangkok, and that was an airfield that the Thai Air Force had recently established. Apart from that, the crew would essentially be fending for themselves. They'd be using improvised landing grounds, racetracks, polo fields, public parks, and in some cases in the Dutch East Indies, they were using essentially just sections of jungle that the Dutch East Indies government had cleared for them. All the fuel had to be taken there. It was an enormous logistical undertaking, and all the spares needed to be carried by the aircraft itself. This section would be during the wet season, so the weather wouldn't be cooperative, the final section. And also, of course, the aircraft would be in need of repairs and service by then, which would present difficulties as well. The flight itself, so Ross was backed by the Vickers company. They obviously perceived his experience in long-distance multi-engine aircraft flight as being significant, as well as his experience in surveying the route firsthand earlier in the year. And I think this put Ross and Keith and their crew at a significant advantage over the other half-dozen competitors in the race, some of whom were flying single-engined aircraft, and none of whom had seen the route firsthand like Ross had, or even flown the Middle East section like he had. For the flight itself, which obviously forms a significant part of the book, I essentially had 5 sources, 5 first-hand accounts that I could rely on. And these were really quite rich. Firstly, I had Keith's diary, which you can see over here on the right. Keith Smith wrote up a diary each night covering their experiences during the day. And it's quite a good source to look at. It's contemporary, it's first-hand. And, you know, there's some candid stuff in there as well. Secondly, there's the Vimi's logbook, which contains, you know, much less detail, I suppose, on the personal experiences of the flight, but has really good evidence about the distances flown and the times when they were leaving and arriving and so on, as well as some other, you know, brief remarks about things that happened on each leg. Then there's Keith's maps, which are held by the State Library of New South Wales. And you can see these maps are great because not only are they marked up with the planned route that they were going to take, but they're also marked up with notes and annotations regarding weather and things that were happening during the flight. Another source that was really useful were some notebooks that the crew used to communicate with each other. Of course, the engine noise made it too loud for them to speak to each other. And with the configuration of the Vimy, Ross and Keith were sitting side by side in the front cockpit, right up the front of the aircraft, between the engines, whereas Shires and Bennett, the mechanics, were sitting in the aft cockpit. So there's no way they could communicate verbally. And they had notebooks and they would hold notes up to each other to communicate in a rudimentary way. But that's a great way for us to sort of see some of the conversations that happened during the flight. The other source, of course, is private correspondence that Ross and Keith wrote during the journey. They sent their parents some letters, and they also wrote to Vickers, to the Vickers company, which was of course sponsoring for them for this flight. Those letters to Vickers are some of the most valuable sources, because in them Ross is far more candid about the technical problems that they were having during the flight. In public, when speaking to journalists, in the accounts they gave to a couple of newspapers they had exclusive deals with, they very much downplayed any technical issues they had, because of course part of the reason Vickers was backing this flight was to advertise their product, to sell aircraft to the post-war civilian air industry world. But in the letters that Ross is writing to Vickers, he's of course being much more honest, and it's clear that they had some significant technical issues, and those really highlight the importance that the mechanics, Shiers and Bennett, played in doing running repairs with very, very little in the way of spare parts during the flight. Another really great source for me was the photographs that the crew took during the flight. Kodak sponsored a kind of competition within a competition during the flight, where they gave each of the crews a Kodak camera and a supply of film, and they offered a cash prize for the best set of negatives of the journey to Australia. And there's some really stunning images taken by the crew members. This one taken by Jim Bennett on the 13th of November as they flew past the French Alps. Really one of my favourite photos actually from the collection. They also had a cinema camera, which they shot some footage on during the flight, and was later turned into a film, which Ross showed around Australia, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But first, the end of the race. So the crew, of course, was successful. They were only one of two crews to complete the journey, two crews that had entered the competition. The other one, Macintosh and Para, of course, they took something like 230 odd days to eventually reach Australia, and that was obviously well within, outside the competition parameters, but it was an extraordinary journey in itself. And I think there's a really great book waiting to be written about their experiences as well. The final part of my book deals with really the arrival in Australia and the few months that followed that. This was a really surprising part of the book for me to research, because I suppose I didn't have any sense of just how just the impact that this all had on Ross returning to Australia after being away for nearly 5 years. He was overnight the most famous Australian in the world. And this photograph of their arrival at Northfield Aerodrome in Adelaide really shows the sort of, sums up the public reaction to their tour around Australia. They were celebrities for months and months going around Australia. They were mobbed everywhere they went. They had practically no privacy anymore. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary the way that people responded to them. One of the things they did do is that Ross and the photographer Frank Hurley, who Ross had met in Palestine with No. 1 Squadron, they put together the photos and film from the flight with additional film that Frank Hurley had shot of their time in Australia, of their tour around Australia in the Vimy, and to create a film of the flight that then Ross and the crew toured around Australia. So essentially Ross and Hurley went to all the big cities and did and showed the film in the big cities, and the other crew members went to the smaller regional towns around Australia. Now, in this day and age, of course, it's all silent film. So what they're showing is a type of film that was quite popular at the time called a travelogue, which is basically a film showing, depicting a journey. And the creator of the film would stand up the front, sometimes to the accompaniment of live music, a piano, for example, or a small orchestra, and they would narrate the film. They would lecture to the film. And Ross and Hurley took their film around Australia during the middle of 1920. And it was a bit hard for me to get precise details on this, but I went through the newspapers and I counted up that they did 140 lectures in 96 days. So that's matinees and evening performances as well. So it's little wonder that Ross was completely shattered and exhausted by this, but also gives an indication of just how much in demand with the public they were. The original film, from the reviews in the newspapers, the original film and lecture apparently went for some 2 hours. Unfortunately, though, I found that only about a 40-minute extract of the film survives in the National Film Sound Archive. I've got an extract to play for you, actually. This is just a few minutes, just to give you an idea of what the film involved. So this is footage of the Vimy being wheeled out at Croydon on the morning they started. You can see here Keith getting into his flying overalls. He's wearing his RAF uniform underneath. And here's Ross on the left getting into his Sidcot. I'd love to, I didn't have time, but I would have loved to have got someone who could do lip reading to you know, kind of script this like Peter Jackson did with his recent film of the First World War. Yeah, so the film, yeah, it was incredibly, you read in the newspapers and the reviewers were obviously really, you know, they were really wrapped with the film and, you know, it was kind of sold out night after night. Ross made quite a bit of money out of it, as far as I can tell. Again, you know, the details on ticket sales and things are a little bit hard to come by, but yeah, the newspapers certainly indicate that a lot of people went and saw it. 14,000 school children saw the film in Adelaide, as reported in the newspapers. So yeah, it was a really big deal. And after Australia, the film was toured overseas. Ross did a run of shows in the UK with it as well. We've got Shires and Bennett in the rear cockpit there. And yeah, this is the 12th of December, 12th of November when they were leaving Croydon. They took off in the snow, in fact. Probably not a great time to begin the flight across Europe, but by that stage, three or maybe four of the other competitors had already started on their way. So there was a lot of pressure on Ross and Keith to get started as well, so as to be competitive. I'm not exactly sure of the provenance of this copy of the film. This one goes for about 45 minutes in total that the National Film Sound Archive has. As I said, I think probably the full two-hour cut has not survived. And I suspect this was edited together later on. The title slides that we see suggest, I think, that maybe it was put together later on to show in cinemas as a feature. But yeah, there's not a lot of information. You can see on the right there, beside Ross's head, you've got the shield, because of course those enormous propellers, four-bladed propellers, spin very, very close to the cockpit on either side. The film does have some aerial footage, some of which was taken during the flight, I think, some of which as well was taken by Hurley in other flights, and he splices together a lot of footage, as he did in much of his work. He spliced together a lot of footage that is more there for narrative than authenticity, I'll say. There's of course another source that, and I'm just reminded when I see some of these captions, because some of these are quotes from a book that came out shortly after Ross's death in 1922. And this was a book that was purported to have been written by Ross describing the journey. It's called 14,000 Miles Through the Air, and it was a big hit at the time. It's a first-hand account by Ross of the journey to Australia. And in my first draft of my book, I actually relied on that quite heavily to talk about the flight, because it's a really ripping read. It's got some great passages and really, really lovely evocative descriptions of flying the Vimy. Then I was dismayed at a later point in my research to find a handwritten copy of the manuscripts in Frank Hurley's papers in Frank Hurley's handwriting. And this confirmed to me a suspicion I had with Ross Smith's book, that it hadn't actually been written by him, that it had been ghostwritten by Hurley. Reading it, I was struck by how different it sounded to his letters. And it just the language it used, the type of tone that he was writing in, it didn't sound like the Ross Smith I'd come to imagine through his own writing. In fact, it sounded a lot more like Frank Hurley and his account to the South Pole, to Antarctica, for instance. So in the end, I really limited my use of that, because I do think that it was probably ghostwritten by Frank Hurley. Here we have a portrait of Ross that was painted shortly after the film tour in late 1920 in Sydney by William McInnes. I think it's incredible that this depicts Ross as a 28-year-old. I mean, to me, he looks like a much older man there. His hair is very quickly receding after the war. And I think it sums up really the impact of not only 5 years of war that spanned Gallipoli, the Flying Corps and the flight to Australia, but also then the tumultuous 6 months of publicity that he faced in the aftermath of the England to Australia air race. And I think he very much was a tired, worn out man. Also, I think it's quite interesting to note that Ross was in Australia for barely a year after the flight. So very towards the end of 1920, he actually boards a ship, and he and Keith go overseas, and they return to the UK. And the idea is that Ross wants to embark on his next great adventure with Keith, and that's a planned flight around the world in a Vickers Viking seaplane. To circumnavigate the world through both the southern and northern hemispheres. I won't say too much about that because I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but of course it's while preparing for that at Brooklands in April 1922 that Ross is tragically killed, along with Jim Bennett, one of the mechanics who'd accompanied him to Australia in 1919. Keith survived because he was running late that morning and wasn't part of the test flight of the Vickers Viking. The final part of the book really deals with Ross's funeral, which was an extraordinary affair. His body was repatriated to Adelaide, and there was a state funeral for him, and it was probably one of the biggest public funerals that Adelaide's ever seen, I think. It took place at St. Peter's Cathedral, which you can see in this picture, and then there was a funeral procession up to North Road Cemetery, where he's buried today, along with Keith and both his parents. Colin, who I mentioned, was killed at Passchendaele's, buried in Belgium at Lissenhoek. And this was an extraordinary event, and I think this photo, in a way, sums up the celebrity and the status and the esteem that South Australians held Ross in at the end of his life. And of course, it was a devastating shock for them. Incidentally, I went there when I launched the book last year, and I stood in this exact spot. And my family and I went to church at St. Peter's, and there's a memorial in there. And it was quite moving sort of thing the day after I'd launched the book, to go and stand there where the funeral happened, and then we walked up to North Road Cemetery and visited the grave, which of course was sort of a symbolic end to my research on Ross Smith's life. So in the end, what do I conclude about this remarkable Australian aviator's life? Well, I describe him as Australia's first great pioneer aviator. And I think really we need to view the work of later aviators like Kingsford Smith and Charlie Ohm and Bert Hinkler and so on, really in the context of what came before, and that was very much established by Ross Smith. I think he played a really significant role in bringing the air age to Australia and in stimulating air-mindedness in Australia. Despite the Australian Flying Corps, despite the base at Point Cook and the flying school at Richmond during the war, aviation was quite remote to Australians during the period of the Great War. There were still very few aircraft in Australia. The flight that Ross and his crew made to Australia, but then particularly the tour they made of the eastern capitals, flying the Vimy first to Brisbane, first through Queensland and then to Sydney and Melbourne and eventually to Adelaide. That was that was an enormous thing for people to see the Vimy, to get this visceral sense that the air age had come to Australia, that aircraft were now at a stage where they could fly across the globe. Yeah, and finally, I think for me it was interesting just seeing how Ross's life was, how he not only influenced the times that he lived in and did some extraordinary things, but also how he was a product of very much of those times, and how his attitudes and his values and the things that he did were very much outside of his control. They were the result of impersonal forces like the empire nationalism I described before, and the sport that he played, and his experiences in the outback and so on. But I might finish it up there and hand back over to Des. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And I hope if you decide to read the book that you thoroughly enjoy it.
Thank you very much. I don't have any questions on the chat line, so if anybody would like to volunteer some questions, please unmute yourself and speak. Anybody? I can hear somebody.
It's Mark here from Long Jetty, New South Wales.
Yes.
I was just wondering what happened to the younger brother, Keith Smith.
Yeah. Okay, Mark. Yeah. So as I mentioned, Keith survived he wasn't involved in the accident. He was absolutely shattered by his brother's death. And remember, of course, Colin had died during the war. So he was personally quite badly affected by all this. Nonetheless, he resolved to resume the around the world flight that Ross and he had planned. Vickers talked him out of this. Of course, my reading of it is that Vickers, John Alcock had also recently been killed flying a Vickers aircraft, and I think to have any more famous aviation pioneers killed in Vickers aircraft would not have been a good look in the early 20s. So Vickers talked Keith out of it and ended up offering him a job, and he became Vickers' agent in Australia. And in that role, he more or less continued until his death in the 1950s. Ironically, though, he sold very little aircraft. I think the first aircraft he managed to sell in Australia weren't until after the Second World War. Mostly he was selling farming equipment and things like that as well. So in one sense, he had a fairly anticlimactic and, afterlife to the great flight.
Mm-hmm. And if I can ask another question, in the annals of international aviation, does Ross and Keith Smith, do they get that much attention, say as Lindbergh and people of that ilk?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Last year with the centenary, I kept hearing about Ross Smith, the forgotten aviator, and the forgotten aviation pioneer. And I don't know if I feel that he has been forgotten. I mean, in the last part of the book, I actually kind of chart how his legacy has resonated throughout the decades. There was a statue erected to him in Creswell Gardens in Adelaide, in central Adelaide, during the 1920s. It was paid for by public subscription, and every year on the anniversary of his death, for at least 2, maybe 3 decades after his death, there was a service there that was very, very well attended. The Vimy is in Adelaide Airport on display there, and I've actually recently heard they're going to be moving it to a much more prominent location. It's sort of stuck out the back of a car park at the moment. So, I mean, I feel that he has probably never been forgotten. In the early 90s, there was a reenactment of the flight in a replica version of the Vimy. So there's been a number of events over the years to mark the flight and to mark Ross Smith's life. He certainly, though, doesn't have the prominence of Charles Kingsford Smith, and I feel that that could be because his career was so short-lived. Again, he spent about a year in Australia after the war, and then he was gone, and he never returned. He died right on the cusp of what would have been his greatest achievement, that round-the-world flight. Also, of course, he has the curse of a very common name, and he shares that name with the other great Australian aviation pioneers. So I think that probably hasn't helped as well.
Another question from anybody? I have a question, if I may. You said that there was the film that was this major film, I think, that was shown in all around Australia, in all the small towns and everything else like that, and that he received some of the proceeds of that. But was that substantial, or are you aware of what happened to all that?
Yeah, so he split the £10,000 prize equally among the crew, which I think is quite a well-known fact, and obviously reflected very well on him in the eyes of the Australian public. So he had £2,500 from his share of the prize money, and the company Union Theatres that sponsored the film tour, they never published ticket sales, and I even tried to contact Event Cinemas, who is the essentially the custodians of the records of Union Theatres, which, if you sort of go, I put together the history of the company, and it's the modern Event Cinemas, which themselves probably aren't doing very well these days. But I contacted them to ask if I could see the records of the 1920s that they had, and if we could sort of look into the history of this remarkable film tour. But they were very uncooperative, I've got to say, and they wouldn't let me see anything, and they wouldn't give me any information, so, which was very unfortunate. But based on, like I said, I basically put the film tour together from the newspaper reports, so reviews in the newspapers and numbers of patrons and so on. And from that, it seems that it did very well. Frank Hurley was managing the whole thing, and he was very much in it for his own publicity as well. And he made sure that he had the limelight during part of the presentation, and I don't doubt that he made a significant amount of money out of it as well. When Ross was killed in April 1922, his estate was valued at a little over £5,000. So that would suggest to me that he might have made a few £1,000s out of the film tour. But given that as a captain in the AIF, I think he was on about £500 a year, a few £1,000s for 3 months worth of work is, it's a significant amount of money. I wouldn't say he died an incredibly wealthy man, but he certainly died with some money as a result of his achievements.
Good answer.
Michael, this is Paul Simidas. That was a very useful talk, great use of the photographs. I have two questions really about the private circumstances of Ross. Firstly, did he consider or have the opportunity for marriage? And secondly, after the war, he would not have been a serviceman as such. He would have been a private entrepreneur engaging on these tasks. Or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, so for the second part of your question, my understanding is that he was discharged from the AIF, as were most at the end of the war. The circumstances of his, when you look at his AIF service record, it is quite interesting though, as to how he gets home. And I can't remember the details, but there was some agreement made because he, of course, forewent the voyage home that the AIF was offering members, of course, because he didn't need it because he was flying an airplane home. But yeah, essentially he was doing this as a private citizen. The question about marriage is a really interesting one, and it's one of what I call the enduring mysteries of Ross Smith that I wasn't able to address. Certainly he never got married, but in trying to determine his romantic relationships, it was frustratingly elusive. At face value, he had none. There's almost no record in the letters to his mother, and otherwise they're very, very candid, very frank about all other things. He briefly talks about a young lady that he was socially seeing when he was recovering in Britain after Gallipoli in 1916, and we hear about her sending him cigarettes and some other things a little bit later on. But that was fleeting. He mentions female company a couple of times while he's staying in India, but it's almost notable that for a man who the press considered such a good-looking man, a handsome man, a dashing man, he had many offers of marriage in the aftermath of the flight. He seems to have enjoyed female company. He loved dancing. It was one of his favorite things, but it seems like he never had any kind of long-term romantic commitments. And indeed, he tells both Keith and his mother at different times during the war that he didn't plan to marry. So I'm not sure what we make of that, but yeah, it's a bit of a question mark over whether he just wasn't being more forthcoming about those things to his mother, or whether he really just didn't have much opportunity. He certainly was pretty busy from the time he left for war until his death. So, that could have just been another factor in it as well.
It's Mark here again. This isn't a question, just a comment. I was recently cleaning out some family memorabilia that I'd inherited, and I came across a flyer for the film that they presented around Australia in 1920, and donated the flyer to the National Film and Sound Archive. They apparently didn't have a copy down there. So
wonderful.
If it's of any interest, you can look it up, or I can send you a PDF.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks, Mark. I am interested. Yeah, I'd like to write a bit more about the film tour, maybe an article, because, yeah, I think it's a really interesting snapshot of how Australians were getting a sense of what flying was like at that time, at a time when, most of them had probably not seen an aircraft up close. They were watching this film. And by all accounts, the film was an absolute spectacle. Frank Hurley, again, the consummate showman, apparently they had a model of the Vimy that was on a wire, and they made it fly over the audience at one point. They had animations in the film that Hurley had created, like an animated map. It looks, of course, grainy and a bit quaint to us, but at the time it was absolutely cutting edge, and it was a real spectacle, as was aviation, of course.
Mm. I'm just looking at the flyer now. It says it's showing at Town Hall in Sydney. There were six night exhibitions and 6 matinees, so 12 shows a week.
Yeah, and they went for between 2 and 3 hours, so that'll give you an idea of the schedule that he subjected himself to.
There was
There's Chef here again. Oh, sorry. No. I'll let someone speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, shortly after Federation, and there was great rivalry between the state, Victoria, and New South Wales. And there was some consternation that the group, the flyers, were going to go direct from Darwin to Melbourne. And the Premier Holden, contacted my father personally and said, "You're a member of the Australian Flying Corps and friend of Smith. Could you make contact with them and induce them to come to Sydney?" Which he personally did. And the Premier wrote a letter which Dad had with him as an invitation to come to Sydney. And at that time, they had trouble with their engines. Dad said, "I've got an engineering operation in Sydney, the Australian Aircraft and Engineering Company, where I can service your aircraft. And secondly, I own Mascot Airport, which is very suitable for flying for a base. And the Premier is very anxious that you should come to the mother city of Australia, Sydney." And he said, "Yes, I would. We'll come down." And that's how they came from Cloncurry back down through Brisbane and Sydney.
Yeah. I read in the newspaper about a committee that had formed in Sydney as well to put pressure on the crew to come to Sydney. But that's incredible with your father's connection there. And you're right. You touched on how the issues they were having with the aircraft, which created a difficult situation for the crew. And again, there's this interesting dynamic between Ross's private correspondence with friends and with Vickers and what he's saying to journalists during that period, because he's essentially saying to journalists that the Vimy is in tip-top condition. In fact, he even claims they could turn around and fly back to Britain with just a basic service, an overhaul. But the reality is the aircraft is literally falling to pieces. They lose a propeller over central Queensland, over the Northern Territory, and have to land and repair that and have that repaired in Ipswich. There's significant engine failures between Sydney and Melbourne. And in fact, Vickers ordered Ross not to fly the aircraft to Adelaide, which of course was his hometown, and he was determined to do that. But this created problems too, because Ross had been telling the press since he arrived in Australia that they were going to fly to Adelaide. So he kept his word to Vickers. He hands the Vickers Vimy over to the government and then promptly asks Prime Minister Billy Hughes for permission to fly the aircraft to Adelaide, which Billy Hughes gave him. Now, Vickers' response to this isn't recorded, but I can imagine they were not too impressed about it. And indeed, the aircraft had a bad mechanical failure. One of the engines had a bad mechanical failure in Adelaide, and they barely made it back to Melbourne, where it was left at Point Cook and, as far as I can tell, never flew again.
Can I just ask something, Michael, again? In my ignorance, there was some sort of book produced of the photos that they put together. Is my recollection right? That there was something put together of the photos that they took over the flight?
Yeah, one of the things that I was struck by looking at that latter period of Ross's life, and particularly the publicity tour, was just how commercialized they became. There was something very modern about that struck me. Everyone wanted a piece of what we might now term the Ross Smith brand. You know, of course, that wouldn't have been an expression they would have used in 1920, but his name became synonymous with commercial ventures. So, for example, a lot of the newspaper reports mentioned in all sorts of places across the globe that they were stopping at, that whenever Ross piled out of the Vimy's cockpit and took off his overalls, that he would always look incredibly well groomed, including cleanly shaven. Well, Gillette picked up on this and actually made an advertisement saying that, you know, the Gillette razor is so easy to use and so versatile and so safe that you can, you know, effectively use it while you're flying an aircraft before you land and greet, you know, thousands of your adoring fans. A board game was produced for Australian children, you know, where they rolled the dice more or less like snakes and ladders and moved an aircraft across the globe. You know, all sorts of commercial products. And Ross writes about this in Correspondence to Friends at the time. He says, we've got this lineup of businessmen outside our hotel room, you know, with all manner of, you know, opportunities for us to engage with. And yeah, I mean, that's included with, what was the example you mentioned again? Sorry, Des?
Was there some production of the photographs that they took, the Kodak photographs?
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, they did produce.
No, that's fascinating though, anyway.
Yeah, basically, so Frank Hurley joined, the photographer Frank Hurley joined them in Queensland. Now, some accounts suggest that Ross invited him. I've also found evidence to suggest that Frank Hurley approached Ross, which would seem very in keeping with Frank Hurley's character. Either way, he accompanied the crew on their flight across Australia, and he took photographs from the air of Australian towns and cities, and that was published in a book. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah, that's right. That's the one. Yeah,
and they're a fantastic historical record of, you know, the urban history of Australia. There's a photo that I was taken by of my hometown Wollongong in there, as well as many other towns and cities across Australia. So that's just one of many. And there's a lot. The State Library of South Australia holds a lot of this paraphernalia. You know, all sorts of merchandise, I suppose you could call it, connected with the England to Australia flight.
Thank you.
Really good.
Do we have other questions, please?
When was the last Vickers Vimy manufactured?
I'm not actually sure about that. Yeah, I'd have to defer to someone else on that notion. I'm not sure about the history of it after the flight.
Gareth, you know anything about that?
Give me a moment and I'll have a look.
There seemed to be a fairly big resource behind you there. Any other questions while we're waiting?
I'd just like to say it's a great book and great reading and a valuable piece of research. Michael.
Thank you, John. That's very kind of you to say.
Hello, Michael. Eric Peterson here. Not on camera, sorry. I just saw they sort of call his death, the accident, death by misadventure. Is that just alluding to pilot error, do you feel?
Yeah, there's a couple of sources that we have to go on that. Well, there's the newspaper accounts, which include some accounts by journalists who were there when it happened. The occasion was the first test flight of the Vickers Viking aircraft, and it was and there was also a motorcycle race on at Brooklands, because as you might know, there's a racing track that rings the airport. And so there were a lot of people there that day. A lot of witnesses saw it, and Ross initially went up with Vickers' chief test pilot, and then Ross was in the second seat. He was just watching, and then Ross jumped over and took control. They landed, the test pilot got out, Ross took control, and it was the first time that he'd flown the aircraft. And something that surprised me was the fact that Ross hadn't really flown much since landing, or since handing the Vickers over at Point Cook in about March 1920 or April 1920. In fact, as far as I can tell, he'd only been at the controls of an aeroplane maybe 3 or 4 times in nearly 2 years. So he was out of practice. The other thing is, Ross talks about the Vimy being an incredibly forgiving aircraft to fly. It's obviously heavy on the controls and so on, but he talked about the fact that it would always give you warning before it stalled, and that, yeah, it was a safe aeroplane to fly. The Vickers Viking, on the other hand, which I don't have a photo at hand, but if you have a look in the book, you'll see it. It looks like a boat attached to wings. It's a very unusual looking aircraft, and it was apparently very tail heavy, and it was an idiosyncratic machine. And yeah, Ross had no experience whatsoever flying it firsthand when he took it up. And he'd only done, I think, about 1 or 2 circuits of Brooklands when he made a sharp turn and got into a spin at a low altitude. And yeah, it very much was concluded both in the coroner's report and the Air Ministry's accident investigation. Both of them concluded that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft. It was handling perfectly well when it was handed over to Ross, but simply that he turned too sharply at too low a speed, at too low an altitude, and you put the aircraft into a spin that he was unable to recover from. So yeah, it was very much pilot error, which of course people at the time had difficulty accepting, because he was regarded as one of the world's great flyers.
Oh, well, thank you for that. It certainly sounds tragic, him not being recent to fly an aircraft. We lost a good person. Thank you very much for your talk, Michael.
Oh, no worries, Eric. And I agree. And I remember when researching and writing that part of the book, I just felt a terrible sense of waste. It seemed so unnecessary, and it seemed uncharacteristically impulsive of him. I mean, he was normally a fairly careful, thoughtful kind of pilot, but it was out of character that he seemed to be in a rush, and yeah, he made one error that had fatal consequences.
Yes.
Gareth, did you find the answer?
Well, they remained in RAF service until the very early 30s, but it looks like production stopped at about 1920-21. But a lot of them were reconditioned after that and remained in service.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions that we have for Michael?
No, if I might just make a few comments, and Michael.
I just have one comment, Michael, is the arrival of the aircraft in Sydney Airport, established as an international. And today, Sydney Airport is the oldest US operating airport in
Oh yeah. I suppose it does make it a first international arrival. I hadn't considered it from that perspective.
Fabulous, thank you, John. There was somebody else who wanted to make a comment.
No, yeah, it was Terry Van Haren from Washington.
Yes.
Thank you. Once again, I'm always impressed how much detail and research you do there, Michael, and how you can bring aviation 100 years ago to life. It's just fantastic. And I liked your analogy of the pillars that brought Ross, Smith to the pioneer stage of aviation. And I think they're very important in a context of even 100 years hence, what we talk about now when we talk about pioneering and innovation in an age of space, maybe. And I'm a little bit concerned, for the other people here, that some of our institutions are sort of, been eroded over time, cadets and stuff like that. That certainly breeds some discipline in young sort of innovators and pioneers that maybe we don't really truly value. But I'm always interested in the demise of these great pioneers and aviators, and I think it's where they get the balance of the science and the art of aviation out of whack, so to speak. Obviously, there was a lot of science in what Ross Smith had done, and a fair bit of art in terms of making balanced sort of calculations and assessing risk. And I suppose it's always the psychological pressures that actually tip people over the edge and make them make poor decisions and actually lead to their demise. Do you see that artistry in your analysis here, Michael?
I do, Terry, and I think you're right in terms of the psychology. And in the days leading up to Ross's death, I talk about in the book, he makes some, again, uncharacteristic remarks to journalists about dismissing risks for this round-the-world flight, which, of course, at the time was an extraordinarily risky undertaking. But he was dismissive of some of those risks. And look, I mean, I don't know, potentially he'd started to believe some of his own press, so to speak. There could have been a bit of ego coming into it there. Also, I think there was a sense of he was restless, and he was restless right through his life. He was always looking for the next thing. He was always pushing the envelope, so to speak, and pushing himself. And I think that he was impatient, and I think it was a character flaw that sadly eventually killed him. He was undoubtedly a good pilot, but he was also a human being and subject to those psychological forces you mentioned. And quite frankly, he was out of practice. Like I said, it had been, he'd had very, very little flying experience for 2 years, and most of his flying experience before that was on aircraft that were comparatively forgiving at the controls.
Yeah, I think it's very apparent. So thanks, Michael. Yeah.
Thanks, Terry.
We need to learn from that.
Any other questions before we close? Gareth, I might hand over to you to express a vote of thanks for Michael and his remarkable talk.
Yes, thank you. Certainly, that was absolutely fascinating, and I think we're all very grateful for Michael for a really great talk. And the little clip from the film was brilliant. Really enjoyed watching that. So yeah, thank you very much. You entertained us royally, and yeah, I'm sure we're all most appreciative. So thank you.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you everyone for tuning in, especially those who are either sitting up very late or getting up very early to do so.